Thank you very much. And I'm going to step out from behind this because of my statuesque height. We don't want you to have to live with talking eyebrows for the next 20 minutes. We're going to take a slightly different perspective on social media, and we're going to spend a little time sharing with you how social media might be used as a research tool, and a little bit about what we learned from global consumers in this space. A little different from social media monitoring, which I agree is a very passive and almost pseudo-voyeuristic approach to research. We're talking about active engagement in the social media space. So we thought the best way to introduce you to us was to tell you a little bit about our social media footprints. So I believe you're going to roll the film for me here. This is my social footprint, a day in my digital life. This is my Facebook page. You will see on those chairs that is snow. I don't live in Barcelona. This is LinkedIn, so that's more my business world. This is my Twitter feed. Tells you a little bit about me. These are some of the people that I follow on Twitter. This is who Apple's recommending I listen to. I'm not sure how the Jackson 5 got in there, and this is from a travel website, which if you could see it up closer, you would realize that I do not go on action-adventure vacations of any sort. And this is a restaurant review and reservation site. So as a researcher, had I had the opportunity to review this a little more closely, had a respondent been willing to share this information with us, you would have discovered about me that I'm married. You actually would have discovered not for the first time, because I have a stepdaughter. You probably could have demised where in New York I live when you looked at the restaurants that I've visited. You would have been able to learn a little bit about my political leanings from who I follow on Twitter. So there's an amazing wealth of information if we can trust and believe it. But I think that, being quite active in this space, I don't think that the fantasy world is as prevalent as we may think. I mean, I tend to believe that most of my friends and colleagues are expressing perhaps a slightly better version of themselves, but largely at the core, it is themselves. Now, as an alternative, let's look at Cecile's footprint.
So it's a much poorer digital life, I'm afraid. My digital life, I joined Facebook because I had a friend who told me, if you want to talk to me, join Facebook. So that's what I did, because he's a very funny bloke and I couldn't get him on the phone. I'm on LinkedIn. I don't even have my picture, but most of my digital life is about some communication and papers that I've been writing, and that's it.
So what you see is, by contrast, Cecile is what I would consider a more moderate user of the social media world, and I would say I'm a more immersed user of the social media world. So what we thought we'd do is start out telling you a little bit about why we think this space is important for marketers and for researchers, and then tell you a little story about what we learned. I do think this is a stereotype-defying space, and I think it's changing so rapidly. I mean, if you look at all the things that people are doing on the social media arena, things like Facebook, Twitter, where we microblog, I know there's a stereotype that this is a youthful medium, but I'll tell you a quite interesting story. My mother passed away recently. She was 78 years old, and one time she said to me, I was home visiting her, and she said, "What is this Facebook thing?" And I said, "Oh, I'll show you, Mom. It's kind of cool." And I logged into my Facebook page, and lo and behold, all of her grandchildren are there. All 10 of my nieces and nephews are my friends on Facebook. And she found that the most amazing thing, because they're spread out all over the world now. It was a way for her, quite passively, she wasn't an active participant, to know what her grandchildren were doing, to be amused by what was going on. Now, I, of course, had to call all of them and said, "Okay, kids, Grandma's in the face space now, so it's not the time to post your last beer party." But what we're seeing is an amazing immersion in this arena. If you look at Facebook alone, it has 500 million users. That's bigger than Japan. That's 1.5 times the size of the US. The average user has 130 so-called friends. Probably within there they have a dozen real friends. And they spend about an hour a week on Facebook. So we decided we were going to try and understand a little bit about where brands could play. And this was part of the launch of our new global network of qualitative team under Firefly. So we talked to people in 15 different countries. And surprisingly, we did the typical research thing. We decided we were actually going to try and understand social media in the social media space. So we engaged in that arena. And what we found was quite interesting. We found that the cohort of people that we were talking to actually had a great deal more in common than they had differences. So not unlike when you study, for example, teenagers, where they feel like they have more in common with other teens around the world than they may have in common with other people in their country of different age groups. There were some universal needs that we saw being fulfilled by social media: the need to communicate, the need for recognition. You know, in some ways people may weigh their value by how many friends they have, by how active they are, by how much response they get to the stimuli that they put out there. But when we put the people together and got them talking to one another, they were surprised by how similar their needs and what they fulfilled through Facebook and other, for example, in China we used Renren. So while social media has a lot in common, they're not all homogenous. And as you obviously know, the stage of development around technology is wildly different in different parts of the world. So we thought we'd share with you some of the most significant differences that we saw. I'm going to start out with Latin America because I think in some ways Latin America is a peek at the future of the social media space. It is a very mobile-driven arena. So far more people engage in social media on a handset, on a smartphone, than they do on a PC. And I think that we're going to see for things like Facebook and Twitter and Renren that this really is the future. And in fact, if you think about it, I didn't bring my BlackBerry up here because it makes microphones do funny things. That's a much more personal space for me than my computer. It's with me all the time. If I'm going to have a dialogue with one of my friends, it's going to be on my handheld device. So in some ways, Latin America is really leading the personal, always-on mobile usage of social media. If you compare and contrast that to what people are interested in India or China, for example, it's quite different. The Latin Americans are a very expressive group of people. The Chinese are really interested in entering into a global conversation and maybe have a little bit of frustration that they aren't fully participating in the world of social media like people in other countries. By contrast, in India, people have been very active in the social media space quite early, but it was through Orkut, which is now a kind of retiring or dwindling brand in social media because the Indians don't want to be seen as being people who are living with sort of second world technology, and they're very, very rapidly migrating to Facebook. So different reasons people are engaging, different ways they're engaging, but for many of the same reasons. So what did we do in this piece of research? Well, we started at sort of the center of most inquiry in the market research space, which is we talked to clients. We went out and asked clients, were they using social media? How did they feel about it? Were they confident? And what we saw was a sort of a massive fear factor, a sense that I know I need to be there, I know there's a lot going on, but I don't know exactly how I should engage. There was a sense that maybe they weren't cool enough, that their brands weren't interesting enough, and that they didn't have permission to be there. So our next step was to find out from consumers how they felt about brands in the space. We started out with consumer blogs. We invited people to participate in the research. We asked them to keep digital diaries where they logged how they used social media, when and why, and for what reasons. We set up a Facebook group where people could dialogue with one another, and we were really more observers than active participants. And then we reviewed all of the people who had participated up to that point, and we invited a small subset into a technique that we call Idea Blog, which is, I guess the easiest way to describe it is it's sort of a purpose-built social network, but it's a walled garden. We invited them into our walled garden, and they had their own social network. In the social network, we could interject with questions. We were part of the conversation, so there's a moderator who's actively engaged. Our clients were actually actively engaged as well. You can actually do some pseudo-quantitative things within this environment, like mini polls. But what we found is, the one caveat is all of these people from around the world were English speakers, but they were from everywhere in the world. But we found that they actually did come together as a network, and quite interestingly, were kind of actually mad at us when we shut down the idea blog, because it is purpose-built for a specific period of time. What was great about it from a researcher's perspective is it has a very ethnographic kind of feel to it. You can observe what's going on in the sort of natural habitat of social media. We also had at least some of the participants who had Skype, who had webcams, so you got some of that human interaction that we get in a typical group situation where we could see the people, they could see each other, which was quite interesting to us. Because people were invited through things like Facebook and even Craigslist, there was a huge pool of virgin respondents, people who had not been over-researched, if there's such a thing. And it was truly a global conversation, as opposed to typically we do a lot of multinational work, where you do the same piece of work in a lot of countries, and then you try and infer global conclusions. This, we really had a genuine global dialogue going on. So as I mentioned, we sort of identified two key kinds, and this is a very simple, very qualitative segmentation. Mavens are people who actively live in the internet space, not just the social media space, but they depend on technology for an awful lot in their life. How they manage their careers, how they manage their finances, how they manage their personal relationships. And that's sort of the category I fall into, not because I'm all that techno-savvy, but because I travel all the time. And this sort of activity is my link back to my world at home, my world at my office when I'm on the road. So I'd say I fall into the Maven category. Moderates aren't necessarily people who don't use social media a lot. For example, if people are familiar with something like Farmville, you will all know someone who must play that damn game 24/7 because they're always on asking you for golden chips or, you know, barn rafters or whatever it is they ask for. So they're not light users in some cases, but they're limited users. This tool fills a very specific need for them. This is Amy. We're going to introduce you to one of our mavens.
I'm 23 and I live in Orange County, California. I'm a graphic designer at a local magazine. Means of like updating the world on what I'm doing. I have a blog that I update try to do it like every day or at least like every other day. Once I have a blog up, I'll plug it on Twitter, which connects to my Facebook. And it's amazing though how much traffic that drives and how many of my friends really had no idea that I did art. It just gives you a lot of opportunities that I never would have had otherwise.
So in spite of the fact that Amy looks like a model, she's not. She's a real consumer who really does live in Southern California, was really active in this qualitative research space that we created. We have videos like this on probably 15 different consumers that we could share. But amazing the amount of things that we learned. And our sense was that somebody like Amy was really quite genuine in her engagement in the space. So what did we learn about where brands can play in this space? Well, for that, I'm going to turn it over to Cecile to tell you the story that we heard.